What if I told you that one of the most powerful acts of defiance against hatred in human history wasn't a grand speech, a political treaty, or a military victory, but a simple cup of tea? What if the bridge between two nations torn apart by the deadliest war ever known was built not by generals or diplomats, but by a 62-year-old British nurse who broke every rule in the book and risked everything to prove that humanity could triumph over propaganda? This is the story of Nurse Eleanor Hartley, and what she did in the ashes of post-war Japan will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this incredible true story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever witnessed a simple act of kindness that changed everything. Now, let's go back to 1946, to a world where trust seemed impossible. And one woman decided to do the unthinkable. August 1946. The war had been over for nearly a year, but in the ruins of Yokohama, Japan, the real battle was just beginning. It wasn't fought with bullets or bombs anymore. It was fought with fear, suspicion, and the deep scars left by years of brutal propaganda on both sides. British occupation forces had set up medical compounds to treat both their own soldiers and, theoretically, the local Japanese population. But there was one problem. The Japanese civilians wouldn't come anywhere near them. Mothers would grab their children and run at the sight of British uniforms. Young women would hide in the CM rubble rather than accept medical help. The propaganda had done its job too well. To these traumatized people, British soldiers weren't liberators or even occupiers. They were demons in human form. Into this powder keg of mistrust walked Nurse Eleanor Hartley, a woman whose presence would soon become one of the most talked about mysteries in the entire occupation zone. At 62 years old, Eleanor was the oldest nurse in the British Medical Corps stationed in Japan, and by all conventional military standards, she shouldn't have been there at all. Most nurses her age had retired or been reassigned to comfortable hospital positions back in London. But Eleanor had specifically requested this posting, pulling strings that puzzled her superiors and writing letters of petition that bordered on desperate. Nobody understood why a woman of her age and decorated service record would want to spend what could be her final years in the devastation and danger of occupied Japan. But Eleanor knew exactly why she was there, and that reason went deeper than anyone could imagine. Eleanor arrived at the Yokohama compound on a gray morning in late July, carrying only a small battered suitcase and an even more battered leather trunk that she refused to let anyone else touch. She was tall and thin, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to hold both profound sadness and inexhaustible kindness. The other nurses noticed immediately that she was different. While they followed protocols with military precision, Eleanor moved through the compound with a quiet deliberation, studying everything, observing the local Japanese workers with an intensity that made some of her colleagues uncomfortable. She asked questions that seemed odd. What were the local customs? What gestures might be considered respectful or offensive? What did the Japanese civilians say among themselves when they thought no one was listening? And most strangely, she spent her evenings in her quarters with that mysterious trunk from which the faint sounds of rustling paper and quiet movement could sometimes be heard. The turning point came on a sweltering August afternoon, just 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival. The compound's commander, Colonel Richard Pemberton, had called a staff meeting to address what he called the civilian cooperation problem. Pemberton was everything Eleanor was not: rigid, by the book, and utterly convinced that military authority was the solution to every problem. He stood before his assembled officers and medical staff with his jaw set firm and his voice clipped with irritation. "The locals refuse our medical services," he announced, his tone suggesting this was a personal insult. "We've set up vaccination clinics, maternal health services, even a feeding program for malnourished children, and they won't come within 50 yards of us. This is unacceptable. We are here to help them, and they will be helped whether they like it or not. I'm authorizing mandatory health checks for all civilians in the surrounding blocks. Military police will escort them here if necessary." The room fell silent. Some of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. That is, until Eleanor Hartley stood up from her seat at the back of the room. The scraping of her chair against the floor seemed thunderously loud in the tense silence. "With respect, Colonel," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet strength that made everyone turn to look at her. "Force will only confirm everything they've been taught to fear about us." Pemberton's face flushed red. "Nurse Hartley, I don't recall asking for input from medical staff on security protocols. And I don't recall taking an oath to harm people by terrifying them." Eleanor replied evenly. "These women have been told for years that we are monsters, that British soldiers will assault them, take their children, destroy what little they have left. If we send military police to drag Them here by force, we prove every lie they've been fed. We don't build trust with bayonets, Colonel. The tension in the room became suffocating. A senior nurse named Margaret Williams, who'd made no secret of her disdain for Eleanor's naive idealism, spoke up with barely concealed scorn. And what do you suggest, Nurse Hartley? That we sing them lullabies and hope they overcome years of indoctrination? These people were our enemies. They celebrated when our boys were dying in the Pacific. Now, they want to play victims. Other voices joined in. She's right, you know. We can't just wait for them to like us. We have a job to do, whether they appreciate it or not. Maybe they need to learn that the war is over, and we're in charge now. Eleanor stood there, surrounded by skepticism and hostility, but her expression never wavered. She looked directly at Colonel Pemberton and said something that would later be reported all the way up the chain of command. Give me 1 week. Let me try. Something different. If it doesn't work, you can proceed with your mandatory protocols. But if I'm right, we might actually accomplish what we were sent here to do. Heal instead of harm. Pemberton laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. And what exactly is this revolutionary approach of yours, Nurse Hartley? Please, enlighten us. Eleanor paused for just a moment, and those who were watching closely saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked like old pain resurfacing. I'm going to make them tea, she said simply. The room erupted. Laughter, incredulous exclamations, angry muttering. Tea? Has she lost her mind? This is a war zone, not a garden party. The old woman's gone senile. Margaret Williams stood up, her voice dripping with condescension. With all due respect, which is very little at this point, what kind of fantasy world do you live in? You think a cup of tea is going to undo years of hatred? You think these women are going to suddenly trust us because you play hostess? This isn't a London social club, Hartley. This is the real world with real consequences. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked around the room at all the skeptical, hostile faces, and then she did something completely unexpected. She spoke in flawless Japanese. Senso wa owarimashita. Shikashi, heiwa wa mada hajimatenai. Peace has not yet begun. The room fell dead silent. Not a single person there, including the Japanese interpreter assigned to the compound, had known that nurse. Eleanor Hartley spoke Japanese, and not just spoke it, but spoke it with the accent and formal grammar of someone who had studied deeply and respectfully. Colonel Pemberton's jaw actually dropped. How do you speak Japanese? Eleanor's voice was quiet but filled with an emotion that made everyone lean forward to hear. My son, James, was a language officer in military intelligence. He fell in love with Japan before the war, studied the language at Cambridge, learned about the culture, the art, the philosophy. He believed that understanding between peoples was the only path to lasting peace. He died in Burma in 1944, convinced to his last breath that the ordinary people on both sides of this war were victims of their government's choices. I'm here because I owe it to him, to his dream, to prove that he was right. That understanding is possible. That humanity can bridge any divide. Her voice cracked slightly on those last words, and for a moment, this stern, composed woman looked fragile and utterly heartbroken. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Margaret Williams looked down at her hands, the wind completely taken out of her sails. But Pemberton, though clearly shaken, wasn't ready to surrender his authority. I'm sorry for your loss, Nurse Hartley. Truly. But personal tragedy doesn't change operational realities. You have 3 days, not a week. 3 days to show some tangible result, or we proceed with mandatory protocols. Dismissed. That evening, Eleanor opened her mysterious leather trunk for the first time since arriving. Inside was a complete Japanese tea ceremony set. A delicate ceramic teapot, small matching cups, a bamboo whisk, a tea scoop carved from a single piece of wood, and several tins of high-quality matcha and sencha tea. These weren't spoils of war or military acquisitions. These were items that had been carefully purchased, lovingly maintained, and clearly treasured. Her son James had sent them to her in letters before. His deployment to Burma, piece by piece, with detailed notes on their significance, their history, and the rituals surrounding their use. Eleanor had spent the last 2 years learning everything she could about the Japanese tea ceremony, not as an academic exercise, but as a way to stay connected to her son's memory, to honor his belief in cross-cultural understanding, and perhaps, deep down, as preparation for this very moment. The next morning, Eleanor did something that sent shockwaves through the entire compound. Instead of reporting for her usual shift in the medical tent, she took her tea set, a small portable brazier, a container of fresh water, and her supplies, and she walked directly out of the compound's main gate. Several soldiers moved to stop her, but she held up a hand. "I'm going to the civilian shelter," she announced calmly. "I won't be needing an escort." "You can't go out there alone," shouted Lieutenant Davies, the young officer on gate duty. "Standing orders. No. Personnel leave the compound without armed escort. It's not safe." Eleanor turned and looked at him with those kind, sad eyes. "I'm a 62-year-old nurse carrying a tea set. If that's threatening enough to require armed guards, then we've already lost." And before anyone could physically restrain her, she walked out into the rubble-strewn streets of Yokohama, heading directly toward the civilian shelters, where displaced Japanese families lived in makeshift homes cobbled together from the ruins. Word spread through the compound like wildfire. "The old nurse has gone mad. She's walking straight into enemy territory." Colonel Pemberton was furious but also trapped. If he sent soldiers after her by force, he'd prove her point about using intimidation. Instead, he positioned observers with binoculars on the compound's perimeter wall, watching helplessly as this elderly British nurse disappeared into what they all considered hostile territory. Eleanor walked slowly through the devastated streets, her tea set carefully balanced in her arms. She could feel eyes watching her from behind broken walls and torn cloth hangings. She heard whispers, gasps, the sound of children being hurriedly pulled inside. Fear was so thick in the air she could almost taste it. Finally, she reached a small open area near the largest civilian shelter, a space that might have once been a neighborhood park, but was now just cleared rubble with a few surviving trees. She carefully set down her items, sat on a piece of broken concrete, and began to prepare tea. She didn't rush. She moved with the precise meditative movements of the traditional tea ceremony, even though she was alone, even though she was being watched by dozens of frightened, suspicious eyes. She purified the utensils. She measured the tea with reverence. She heated the water to the correct temperature. She whisked the matcha with the bamboo whisk until it formed the perfect foam. And then she poured herself a cup, took a sip, and waited. Minutes passed. 10 minutes. 20. The sun beat down. Sweat trickled down Eleanor's back under her nurse's uniform. From the shadows she could hear urgent whispered conversations in Japanese. What is she doing? Is it a trap? Why is she alone? Is that a tea ceremony? Don't be ridiculous. Why would a British soldier perform a tea ceremony? Finally, after nearly 45 minutes, an elderly Japanese woman emerged from the shadows. She was tiny, bent with age and hardship, her clothes tattered but clean. Her face was deeply lined, and her eyes held a combination of fear and desperate curiosity. She approached slowly, ready to flee at any moment. Eleanor looked up at her, and without saying a word, she bowed. Not a casual nod, but a deep, respectful bow of greeting, the kind that acknowledged the woman's dignity and worth. Then Eleanor spoke in Japanese, her voice gentle. "I am Eleanor. I would be honored if you would share tea with me." The old woman stood frozen, shock written across her face. A British nurse, speaking Japanese, performing a tea ceremony, offering respect instead of demands. It didn't fit any narrative she'd been given. Slowly, trembling, she lowered herself to sit across from Eleanor. Eleanor prepared another cup of tea with the same careful reverence and handed it to the woman with both hands, exactly as tradition demanded. The woman took it, her hands shaking, and brought it to her lips. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, a single tear rolled down the old woman's weathered cheek. She looked up at Eleanor and whispered in Japanese, "You know our ways." "I am trying to," Eleanor replied softly. "My son loved your culture. He believed that we were all connected, all human, all deserving of dignity. The war is over, but peace has not yet begun. Let us begin it here, you and I, with this tea." More women began to emerge from the shadows. First one, then 3, then a dozen. Young mothers clutching. Babies, teenage girls, grandmothers, all of them approaching with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Eleanor prepared tea for each one, bowing to each one, speaking soft words in their own language. Some of the women wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, holding their teacups as if they were made of the most precious substance on earth. Because in that moment, they were. They were physical proof that the monsters of their nightmares were, in fact, just people. Flawed, grieving, hopeful. People who could choose kindness over cruelty. Back at the compound, the observers on the wall were struggling to understand what they were seeing. "Sir, Lieutenant Davies reported to Colonel Pemberton, his voice filled with disbelief. "There are now over 20 Japanese civilians sitting with Nurse Hartley. They're drinking tea. They're talking. Some of them are smiling, sir." Pemberton grabbed the binoculars and looked for himself. What he saw shook him to his core. There, in the rubble of a destroyed city, a British nurse and Japanese civilians sat together in a circle, sharing tea, sharing conversation, sharing humanity. It was the most subversive, revolutionary, powerful act of defiance against everything the war had tried to teach them, and it was happening through the simple act of preparing tea with respect and love. But not everyone at the compound was moved. Margaret Williams, watching from the wall, felt her face flush with anger, and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. "It's a show," she muttered to the nurse standing next to her. "She's manipulating them with their own cultural symbols. It's exploitative." But her voice lacked conviction, and deep down she knew she was watching something genuine, something that exposed her own hardness and prejudice. She turned away from the wall, unable to watch anymore, unable to confront what it meant about her own choices and beliefs. Eleanor stayed in that clearing for 6 hours that first day. As the sun began to set, she carefully packed up her tea set, bowed deeply to each woman present, and promised to return the next day. As she walked back toward the compound, several of the Japanese women followed her at a distance, their fear diminishing but not gone. When she reached the compound gates, Colonel Pemberton was waiting for her, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and reluctant admiration. "That was the most reckless, insubordinate, idiotic thing I have ever seen a member of this unit do," he said, his voice tight. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "And it was also effective, Colonel. Tomorrow I believe some of those women will come to the medical clinic. Not because they're forced. Because they choose to. You could have been killed. I could have been," Eleanor agreed. "But I wasn't. Because they're not the monsters we've been told they are, just as we are not the monsters they've been told we are. Fear is a choice, Colonel. So is compassion. I choose compassion." The next day, Eleanor was back in the clearing at dawn, preparing tea. This time the women came out of the shadows more quickly. Some brought their children, a few brought small offerings, a handful of rice, a piece of cloth, a simple drawing made by a child. And Eleanor accepted each gift with deep bows and genuine gratitude, understanding that these people had almost nothing, and they were sharing it with her. The message was clear. We see you as human too. On the third day, everything changed. Eleanor was in the middle of preparing tea when a harsh voice cut through the peaceful scene. "What is the meaning of this?" A middle-aged Japanese man, thin and severe-looking, strode into the clearing. Several of the women gasped and tried to move away, but he gestured sharply for them to stay. This was Takeshi Yamada, a former local government official who had been a staunch supporter of the war effort and who still held considerable influence in the displaced community. He had been watching Eleanor's tea ceremonies from a distance, and his rage had been building with each passing day. "You defile our traditions!" he shouted in Japanese, his face twisted with anger. "You, a British invader, dare to use our sacred rituals as a weapon? You think a foreign woman performing a mockery of our tea ceremony will erase what your people did to our cities, our families? You think we are fools to be won over by this theatrical manipulation?" Several of the women tried to speak, but Yamada silenced them with a glare. "And you!" He turned his fury on the gathered women. "You sit here drinking tea with the enemy, while our men lie dead, while our country lies in ruins. Have you no shame? No honor?" The atmosphere, which had been peaceful and healing, turned instantly toxic. Some of the younger women began to cry. Others looked down at the ground, their newfound trust crumbling under the assault of traditional authority and masculine rage. Eleanor sat down, her tea whisk carefully, and looked up at Yamada. Her face was calm, but there was steel beneath that calm. "Yamada-san," she said quietly, using the respectful honorific, "you are right to be angry. Your country has suffered terribly. Your people have lost so much. But I am not your enemy. I never was. I am a nurse. I have spent my entire life healing, not harming. You speak our language like a parrot mimicking sounds it does not understand." Yamada spat back. "You perform our ceremonies like an actress playing a role. You know nothing of what these rituals mean, nothing of the spirit behind them. This is insult added to injury, and I will not allow it to continue." Eleanor rose slowly to her feet. She was taller than Yamada, but she didn't use her height as an advantage. Instead, she bowed again, deeply, more deeply than before. When she straightened, her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "You are right that I do not fully understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How could I? I am not Japanese. I was not raised with these traditions in my bones. But I learned them because my son learned them. My son, who loved your culture, who believed that Japan and Britain could be friends, who died thousands of miles from home trying to end a war that should never have started." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was breaking. "My son James sent me this tea set, piece by piece, in letters from Cambridge, before he was deployed. Each item came with pages of explanation about its significance, its history, the respect it demanded. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would learn to use it properly, to honor the culture he had come to love. He died in Burma, Mr. Yamada. He died believing that people like you and I could sit together and find common ground. He died believing that the Japanese people were not our enemies, that we were all victims of forces larger than ourselves. I came here to honor his memory. I came here to prove he was right." The clearing was absolutely silent. Even Yamada seemed temporarily struck speechless. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She handed it to Yamada with both hands, respectfully. "This is James," she said quietly. "This picture was taken at Cambridge in 1938. He's standing outside the East Asian Studies building, holding a book of Matsuo Basho's haiku poetry. He was 23 years old. He never got to visit Japan, though. He dreamed of it. He never got to meet people like you, though he wanted to more than anything. He never got to see if his beliefs about human connection transcending national conflict were true. All I can do now is try to live out his dream for him." Yamada took the photograph with trembling hands. He stared at it for a long moment, at the young man with the bright smile and eager eyes, holding his Japanese poetry book like a treasure. When he looked back up at Eleanor, his expression had changed. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Recognition of shared grief, shared loss, shared humanity. "You have lost family in this war?" he asked, his voice much quieter now. "My son," Eleanor said simply. "My only child." "I have lost 2 sons," Yamada replied, his voice hollow. "And a daughter. And my wife. In the bombing of Tokyo. I have lost everything except my anger. And now you want to take even that from me?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No. Your anger is yours. Your grief is yours. I would never presume to take that from you. But perhaps we can share the burden of it. Perhaps we can grieve together, as parents who have lost children, rather than as enemies who hate each other. Perhaps that is where peace truly begins." Yamada stood there, the photograph still clutched in his hands, his entire body trembling. The women in the clearing were watching with wide eyes, holding their breath. Then, slowly, Yamada's face crumpled. This stern, angry man, who had been trying so hard to hold on to his rage, his sense of righteous fury, began to weep. Deep, racking sobs that came from a place of profound pain. He sank to his knees in the rubble, still clutching James's photograph, and cried like a child. Eleanor moved around the tea setup and knelt beside him, not touching, just being present. After a long moment she said softly, "They told us you were monsters. They showed us propaganda about Japanese soldiers committing atrocities, about a cruel and inhuman enemy. And I'm sure your government told you the same things about us. We were both lied to, Mr. Yamada. We were both manipulated into hating people we had never met. But the war is over now. The governments that lied to us are gone. What remains is just us, just people, trying to survive, trying to heal, trying to find a reason to hope again." Yamada looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "How can you not hate us? After losing your son? Because hating you won't bring him back," Eleanor said simply. "And because James wouldn't want me to. He spent his life trying to build bridges. The least I can do is try to walk across them.